That metal buried more good men than this courtroom ever will. The words settled over courtroom 4B like cold fog rolling across a graveyard, low and heavy and impossible to ignore. Judge Alan Pierce leaned back in his leather chair beneath the state seal, his expression tightening with irritation as fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The stale air of the courthouse smelled of old paper, floor polish, and burnt coffee drifting in from somewhere down the hall. At the defense table sat Samuel Mercer, 89 years old, shoulders slightly bent beneath a faded brown overcoat despite the mild October weather outside. A weathered wooden cane rested against his leg. Around his neck hung a tarnished military medal suspended from a pale blue ribbon that had lost most of its color decades ago. One corner of the medal was bent inward, as though something violent had once struck it hard enough to scar steel itself. Judge Pierce stared at it with open disdain. "Mr. Mercer," he said sharply, tapping a pen against the bench, "this courtroom is not a theater stage for cheap patriotic performances." A few nervous chuckles fluttered through the gallery before dying almost immediately. Samuel did not react. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on the courtroom flag, standing near the wall behind the prosecution table. The old man's silence only seemed to irritate the judge further. "You expect this court to believe those decorations are authentic?" Pierce continued. "Half the internet sells fake medals for under $50. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the bailiff near the door lowered his eyes for a moment. Samuel finally turned his head slightly. The overhead lights reflected faintly across the scarred metal resting against his chest. "I never asked anyone to believe anything," he said quietly. His voice was rough with age, but steady. Judge Pierce scoffed. "Convenient answer." He shuffled papers aggressively across his desk. For the record, Mr. Mercer was cited for failure to comply with municipal property maintenance standards after repeated notices regarding his residence. He glanced over his glasses with the confidence of a man fully in control of his kingdom. And now he arrives wearing military decorations, apparently hoping for sympathy. Samuel's fingers tightened almost invisibly around the curved handle of his cane. The courtroom remained still except for the distant ticking of a wall clock. Near the back row, court reporter Claire Donovan paused her typing for just a second. Something about the old man unsettled her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was the opposite. Samuel Mercer sat through the humiliation with the calm stillness of someone who had already survived things no courtroom could threaten him with. Judge Pierce leaned forward again. "Remove the medal." The command landed hard in the silent room. Samuel looked at him for the first time directly. There was no anger in his face. No challenge. Only exhaustion layered over something much older and colder. "No," he answered softly. Pierce's jaw tightened. "Excuse me." Samuel's eyes drifted downward briefly toward the bent edge of the medal. For the smallest fraction of a second, the courtroom disappeared from his mind. Rain hammered somewhere far away. Rotor blades echoed through thick jungle heat. Mud soaked through his boots while distant radio chatter cracked through humid darkness. Then the memory vanished just as quickly. Samuel looked back up. That medal stays where it is. The tension inside the courtroom sharpened immediately. Claire could feel it now, spreading through the room like static before a lightning strike. Judge Pierce removed his glasses slowly, clearly savoring the authority of the moment. "Mr. Mercer," he said coldly, "you will comply with this court, or I will hold you in contempt." Samuel said nothing. The old man simply rested one weathered hand over the scarred metal hanging against his chest, while somewhere outside the courthouse, far beyond the stained courthouse windows, the distant sound of approaching sirens quietly began to echo through the city streets. The faint sound of sirens outside faded beneath the growing tension inside courtroom 4B. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Judge Alan Pierce slowly placed his glasses back onto the bridge of his nose and stared down at Samuel Mercer with the cold impatience of a man enused to defiance. "You are already pushing this court dangerously far," he said. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness." Samuel remained seated at the defense table, one hand resting calmly across the scarred metal hanging against his chest. The old ribbon shifted slightly with each shallow breath he took. Claire Donovan watched him carefully from behind her stenotype machine. Up close, the veteran did not look theatrical or attention-seeking the way the judge described him. He looked tired, deeply tired. like a man who had spent decades carrying memories heavier than the metal itself. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly. Somewhere down the hallway, a copy machine groaned to life before falling silent again. Small, ordinary sounds that somehow made the courtroom tension feel even sharper. Judge Pierce leaned forward. Bailiff. The large man near the door straightened immediately. Yes, Your Honor. Pierce pointed toward Samuel without taking his eyes off him. Remove the metal. The words landed like a hammer strike against stone. Claire's fingers froze above her keyboard. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably again, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Even the bailiff hesitated. Your Honor, he said carefully, perhaps we should simply continue with the hearing. Did I ask for your opinion? Pierce snapped. The bailiff swallowed hard and stepped forward reluctantly. Samuel never looked at him. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, somewhere distant and unreachable. The old man's fingers tightened slightly against the ribbon. Claire noticed the subtle movement immediately. Then she noticed something else. Samuel's breathing had changed. Slower now. Controlled. Like someone preparing to endure something unpleasant without complaint. The bailiff stopped beside him. Sir, he said quietly, almost apologetically, please do not make this harder than it needs to be. Samuel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. That metal belonged to better men before it belonged to me. The room fell silent again. Claire felt a strange chill crawl across her arms. Judge Pierce rolled his eyes dramatically. Enough with the cryptic war stories. Samuel's thumb brushed against the bent corner of the metal. Instantly, the stale courthouse air disappeared from his mind. Humid jungle heat pressed against his skin instead. Rainwater dripped from broad jungle leaves in heavy rhythmic drops. Somewhere nearby, helicopter rotors chopped through thick night air while green radio lights flickered inside the darkness. Young faces moved through mud and smoke, carrying exhaustion in their eyes. Samuel could still hear one of them laughing despite the storm overhead. A voice from long ago. Young. Certain. Alive. Then the memory vanished. The courtroom returned all at once beneath the hard white lights overhead. Samuel blinked slowly. His expression never changed, but Claire saw it now. The grief hidden beneath the silence. Judge Pierce mistook it for surrender. There we are, he said smugly. Reality finally setting in. Claire looked down at the open database on the small monitor beside her station. During the argument, she had quietly typed Samuel Mercer's name into the Federal Military Archive out of curiosity. The screen had not displayed service records. It had not displayed medals. It displayed only a dark warning box in bold red letters. Access restricted. Classified records. Authorization required. Claire stared at the screen, her heartbeat quickening. Across the courtroom, Judge Pierce was still speaking. One final opportunity, Mr. Mercer. Remove the medal voluntarily, or this court will do it for you. Samuel slowly lifted his eyes toward the judge. Calm. Steady. Unafraid. Then, from somewhere outside beyond the courthouse windows, came the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicle doors slamming shut one after another. The sound outside grew louder by the second. Heavy doors closing. Engines idling. Radios crackling faintly somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. Inside courtroom 4B, the tension had become almost physical, pressing down on everyone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Judge Alan Pierce either did not notice or pretended not to. He sat rigid behind the bench, jaw tight with irritation as the bailiff remained. Frozen beside Samuel Mercer, uncertain whether to obey the order or step away entirely. Claire Donovan could barely focus on her breathing now. Her eyes stayed locked on the warning message glowing across her monitor screen. Access restricted. Classified records. She typed Samuel Mercer's name again carefully, checking for spelling errors. The same result appeared instantly. No service history. No discharge records. No medal citations. Just a classified lockout that ordinary veterans did not receive. Her stomach tightened. Across the courtroom, Samuel remained motionless at the defense table, one weathered hand still resting over the scarred metal hanging from his neck. The old ribbon shifted softly against his coat whenever he breathed. Judge Pierce exhaled sharply through his nose. Bailiff, I am not going to repeat myself again. The large man beside Samuel looked deeply uncomfortable now. Your Honor, he said carefully, perhaps we should recess for a few minutes. No, Pierce slammed his palm against the bench hard enough to echo across the room. Several people in the gallery jumped. This man has disrupted my courtroom long enough with this nonsense. Samuel slowly lifted his eyes toward the judge. There was still no anger there. No fear either. Just the same exhausting calm that somehow unsettled everyone more than shouting ever could. Claire stared at him, trying to understand why the old man seemed completely unsurprised by any of this. Most people would have panicked hours ago. Samuel Mercer sat beneath the pressure like stone beneath rain, worn by time, unmoved by force. Claire quietly reached for her phone beneath the desk. Her fingers hesitated only briefly before scrolling through her contacts. She stopped at one name. Colonel David Donovan, retired Air Force. Her uncle, the man who never talked much about military service but always went silent whenever certain wars appeared on television. Claire pressed call and lowered the phone beneath the desk as it rang. Once, twice. Then his familiar gravelly voice answered. "Claire, Uncle David," she whispered quickly. "I need you to listen carefully." Judge Pierce continued talking in the background, his voice rising with irritation while papers shuffled sharply across the bench. Claire turned slightly away and lowered her voice further. "There is an old veteran here named Samuel Mercer." Silence. Complete silence on the other end. Claire frowned. "Uncle David." When he finally spoke again, his tone had completely changed. "What did you say?" "Samuel Mercer," Claire repeated. "The courtroom database says his records are classified." She heard movement immediately on the other end of the line. A chair scraping sharply across hardwood floors. "Claire," her uncle said slowly, "tell me exactly what metal he is wearing." Claire glanced toward Samuel. The pale blue ribbon caught the overhead light faintly while the bent metal rested against his chest. Blue ribbon. Old silver metal. One corner looks damaged. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Heavy. The kind that carried weight behind it. "Claire," David finally said quietly, "is Judge Pierce giving him trouble?" Claire looked up just in time to hear Pierce speak again. "Remove it now, or I will have this courtroom cleared." Samuel did not move. Claire swallowed hard. "Yes," she answered softly into the phone. "He is threatening to take the metal." Her uncle inhaled sharply. For a brief moment, Claire thought the line had disconnected again. Then his voice returned colder than she had ever heard it before. "Listen to me carefully. Do not let anyone touch that metal." Claire's pulse quickened instantly. "Why?" she whispered. But her uncle was already moving on the other end. She could hear drawers opening, keys jangling. "Because if that really is Samuel Mercer," he said quietly, "then half the Pentagon still owes that man their lives." The line went dead. At that exact moment, the courthouse hallway outside erupted with the sharp, synchronized sound of heavy boots moving fast toward the courtroom doors. The sound of boots outside the courtroom grew louder with frightening precision. Not rushed, not chaotic, controlled, professional. Every step echoed sharply through the courthouse hallway like the ticking of a countdown nobody inside fully understood yet. Judge Alan Pierce finally looked toward the courtroom doors, irritation flashing across his face. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. Claire Donovan sat frozen behind her desk, her phone still resting in her trembling hand beneath the counter. Her uncle had hung up less than 30 seconds earlier, but the cold warning in his voice still echoed in her ears. Half the Pentagon still owes that man their lives. Across the room, Samuel Mercer remained completely still at the defense table. The old veteran's hand rested calmly over the scarred metal against his chest, while the pale ribbon shifted softly beneath the courthouse lights. He looked neither surprised nor concerned by the growing commotion outside. If anything, his expression seemed distant now, as though the sounds approaching down the hallway belonged to another lifetime entirely. Judge Pierce slammed his gavel once against the bench. "This hearing will remain in order," he snapped. "Bailiff, finish carrying out the court's instruction." The bailiff hesitated again beside Samuel. Sweat glistened faintly across his forehead now. He had spent nearly 20 years working courthouse security, and instinct was screaming at him that something about this situation had gone terribly wrong. Before he could answer, the courtroom doors swung open hard enough to rattle the glass panels beside them. Every head turned instantly. 3 uniformed military police officers stepped into the room first, dressed in dark formal service uniforms with polished badges catching the fluorescent light. Their expressions were calm but absolute. The lead officer scanned the room once before speaking in a firm voice. Nobody move. A stunned silence swallowed the courtroom whole. Judge Pierce rose halfway from his chair, furious. What is the meaning of this interruption? The officer ignored him completely. Behind the military police, more figures entered the courtroom. 2 senior officers in dress uniform. Then several men in dark suits wearing discreet earpieces. The atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Even people with no military background could feel it. Authority had just entered the building at a level far beyond anything Judge Pierce controlled. Claire noticed the prosecutor slowly lowering his eyes toward the floor. The bailiff instinctively stepped backward away from Samuel Mercer. Judge Pierce's confidence faltered for the first time all morning. You cannot simply storm into my courtroom, he barked. I demand identification immediately. Nobody answered him. The military police instead moved calmly to either side of the room near the walls, their posture disciplined and perfectly still. Then the hallway outside fell silent. Completely silent. One final set of footsteps approached slowly toward the doorway. Heavy, measured, the kind of footsteps that carried command without needing volume. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath at once. A tall older man in a dark green army dress uniform finally entered through the doorway. 4 silver stars gleamed beneath the courthouse lights. General Victor Langford, Chairman Level Command Authority. The room froze instantly. Claire heard someone in the gallery gasp quietly beneath their breath. Even Judge Pierce stopped speaking mid-sentence. General Langford's silver hair was cut short and sharp. His face carried the weathered lines of age, but his eyes remained cold and alert beneath the courtroom lights. He did not look at the judge first. He did not look at the military police. His eyes locked immediately onto Samuel Mercer sitting silently at the defense table. For the first time all morning, emotion crossed the general's face. Not anger, not shock, something heavier, older. He took 2 slow steps forward into the silent courtroom. Then he spoke in a low voice that carried effortlessly through the room. Who? He asked carefully. Ordered Sergeant Mercer to remove that medal? Nobody answered. Nobody even moved. Judge Pierce stood completely still behind the bench while the color slowly drained from his face. Samuel finally lifted his eyes toward the general. The old veteran said nothing. But for the first time since entering the courthouse that morning, the exhaustion in his expression softened slightly, as though some invisible burden had just become lighter. The silence inside courtroom 4B became suffocating after General Victor Langford spoke. Nobody seemed willing to move beneath the hard fluorescent lights overhead. The military police remained perfectly still along the walls while courthouse staff stared in open confusion at the 4 silver stars standing near the entrance. Judge Alan Pierce swallowed once before finally clearing his throat. General, he said carefully, forcing authority back into his voice, this is a civilian courtroom. I do not appreciate armed personnel interrupting judicial proceedings. General Langford slowly turned his head toward the bench. His expression remained calm, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees beneath his gaze alone. Then perhaps, he said quietly, you should not have attempted to publicly humiliate one of the most decorated men this country ever buried in classified paperwork. The words landed heavily across the courtroom. Claire Donovan saw the prosecutor lower his eyes completely now. Even the bailiff had unconsciously stepped farther away from Samuel Mercer, as though understanding at last that the old man sitting quietly at the defense table was not ordinary in any sense of the word. Judge Pierce straightened defensively behind a bench. I was enforcing courtroom procedure, he insisted. That medal has not been verified. General Langford stared at him for several long seconds before speaking again. Verified. His voice remained low and controlled. Judge Pierce, that medal was personally approved under executive authorization before you even graduated high school. A faint ripple moved through the gallery benches behind Claire. Nobody whispered. Nobody dared. Samuel Mercer remained silent through all of it. The old veteran sat exactly as he had before, one hand resting lightly against the scarred metal while the other held the curved handle of his cane. He looked exhausted by the attention more than anything else. General Langford took several slow steps forward until he stood only a few feet from the defense table. For the first time, the general's hardened military posture softened slightly. You disappeared again, he said quietly toward Samuel. Samuel's eyes lifted toward him. I was not hiding, he answered softly. I was resting. The words carried an old familiarity that nobody else in the room fully understood. Claire watched General Langford carefully. The four-star commander looked less like a powerful military leader in that moment and more like a man standing before someone he deeply respected. The general's eyes drifted downward toward the bent corner of the medal hanging against Samuel's chest. His jaw tightened subtly. "You still wear it," he said. Samuel looked down at the scarred medal briefly. Some promises do not come off. For a moment the courthouse seemed to disappear from his eyes again. Humid jungle rain fell through darkness lit only by weak red emergency lights. Thick rotor wash hammered against soaked earth, while distant radio chatter cracked through the storm. Young soldiers moved through waist-deep mud carrying stretchers beneath towering jungle trees. Somewhere nearby, a frightened lieutenant with blood soaked across his sleeve kept repeating the same words over and over into a damaged field radio. "We are losing the landing zone. We are losing the landing zone." Samuel remembered cold rain dripping from the edge of his helmet, while a young Captain Victor Langford stood beside him, barely 23 years old, and trying not to let fear show in front of the men. Then came the metallic impact against Samuel's chest, sharp enough to knock him backward into the mud. The metal hanging beneath his jacket had folded inward under the force, leaving the deep scar still visible decades later. The memory vanished beneath the courtroom lights. Samuel blinked once and looked back up calmly. General Langford exhaled slowly through his nose. He understood exactly where Samuel had gone just now because he had been there too. Judge Pierce shifted uncomfortably behind the bench. "If this hearing is overrun by military intimidation," he began nervously, "I will contact federal oversight immediately." General Langford turned toward him fully now. "Judge," he said quietly, "federal oversight is already here." At that exact moment, another man in a dark suit entered the courtroom doorway carrying a sealed folder marked with a gold federal insignia. The military police immediately stepped aside for him without a word. The man carrying the sealed federal folder walked into courtroom 4B with the calm confidence of someone who knew every person in the room would eventually obey him. He wore a dark charcoal suit without a single wrinkle, and the gold insignia stamped across the folder in his hand immediately drew every eye in the courtroom. The military police stepped aside without hesitation as he approached General Victor Langford. Judge Alan Pierce straightened defensively behind the bench. "This courtroom is under civilian jurisdiction," he said sharply, though the edge in his voice was beginning to crack. "You cannot simply invade legal proceedings because of a decorated veteran." The suited man finally looked toward the judge. "Decorated veteran?" he repeated calmly. "That is an unusually small description for Sergeant Samuel Mercer." He handed the sealed folder directly to General Langford. The general opened it slowly beneath the fluorescent lights while absolute silence consumed the room once more. Claire Donovan could hear the faint rustle of paper echoing through the courtroom, as if every sound had suddenly become amplified. Samuel Mercer remained seated without moving. The old man looked almost detached from the growing storm surrounding him, his weathered fingers still resting lightly over the bent metal against his chest. General Langford removed several documents from the folder and studied them briefly before looking back toward the bench. "Judge Pierce," he said quietly, "do you know why Sergeant Mercer's records are classified?" Pierce crossed his arms tightly. "I assume you are about to tell me." The general nodded once. In 1969, a reconnaissance team disappeared inside a region that officially did not exist according to public military records. Weather conditions collapsed air support. Communications failed. Extraction was considered impossible. The room remained perfectly silent except for the faint hum of overhead lighting. General Langford continued carefully. 3 helicopters attempted recovery operations over 48 hours. 2 never returned. Claire felt chills crawl slowly across her arms. Samuel's expression never changed, but his eyes drifted downward slightly as though hearing distant ghosts speaking somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. The general looked toward him briefly before continuing. Sergeant Mercer volunteered to remain behind after the final extraction window collapsed. Judge Pierce frowned impatiently. "What does any of this have to do with this courtroom?" General Langford's eyes hardened instantly. "Everything." The single word struck the room like a hammer. The general stepped closer toward the bench now. Because the man sitting in front of you held together the collapse of an entire operation long enough to save 19 Americans trapped inside hostile jungle terrain during conditions most soldiers would not survive 6 hours in. Claire saw the prosecutor slowly remove his glasses and lower his head. Even the bailiff stared at Samuel differently now, not with curiosity anymore, with disbelief. Judge Pierce opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. For the first time all morning, he looked genuinely uncertain. General Langford lifted one of the documents from the folder. "This medal," he said quietly, "was personally authorized after direct review by the Joint Chiefs under classified wartime exemptions." His eyes shifted toward the bent corner of the medal hanging against Samuel's chest. The damage occurred during extraction when Sergeant Mercer shielded a wounded communications officer from incoming debris during emergency evacuation. Samuel's thumb brushed lightly against the scarred edge again. The courthouse vanished from his memory for another fleeting instant. Hot rotor wash thundered across jungle mud while smoke drifted through dark trees under pounding rain. A young soldier no older than 19 clung to a damaged radio while shouting coordinates through static-filled transmissions. Samuel remembered the weight of soaked gear pulling against his shoulders and the metallic impact striking his chest hard enough to steal the air from his lungs. Then came the terrified voice beside him. "We cannot leave them here, Sergeant." Samuel blinked slowly and returned to the courtroom once more. General Langford carefully closed the federal folder. "For 53 years, he said softly, Sergeant Mercer requested no recognition, no interviews, no ceremonies, and no public acknowledgement for any of it." The general's gaze slowly lifted toward Judge Pierce. "And today you called his medals fake." Nobody in the courtroom moved. Nobody even looked at the judge anymore. The silence itself had become judgment. The silence inside courtroom 4B no longer felt tense. It felt sacred. Judge Alan Pierce stood motionless behind the bench while the weight of everything General Victor Langford had revealed settled across the room like falling ash. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody shifted in their seats. Even the faint hum of the courthouse lights seemed distant now. Samuel Mercer remained seated quietly at the defense table with one weathered hand resting over the bent metal against his chest. His pale gray eyes stayed lowered toward the floor, almost uncomfortable with the attention surrounding him. General Langford slowly stepped closer until he stood directly beside the old veteran. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Claire Donovan noticed the subtle change in the general's face as he looked down at Samuel. The cold authority that had entered the courtroom earlier was gone now. In its place was something far more personal. Respect. The kind forged slowly through years most people could never understand. "You still carry that old cane," Langford said softly. Samuel glanced briefly at the worn wooden cane beside his leg. "It still works." A faint smile touched the corner of the general's mouth before fading again almost immediately. "You always said equipment only matters if it survives the rain." Several people in the courtroom exchanged confused looks, but Samuel gave a small nod as though hearing the voice of a much younger man standing somewhere far away. Outside the courthouse windows, gray October clouds drifted low across the city skyline, while distant sirens faded back into ordinary traffic noise. Inside the courtroom, time itself seemed slower somehow. Judge Pierce finally found his voice again. "General," he said carefully, "while I respect military service, none of this changes courtroom procedure." Nobody looked at him. The judge's words fell flat against the silence. General Langford reached into the inside pocket of his dress coat and removed something small wrapped carefully in faded green cloth. Claire leaned forward slightly behind her desk. The general unfolded the cloth slowly with both hands. Inside rested an old tarnished military compass scratched deeply across the surface. Samuel's eyes locked onto it instantly. For the first time since entering the courthouse, real emotion crossed the old veteran's face. Not pride, not anger, pain, deep and ancient. "I thought that was gone," Samuel said quietly. Langford looked down at the compass for a moment. "They found it in the archives after Colonel Bishop passed away." The general turned the scratched metal object over carefully beneath the fluorescent lights. "He kept it on his desk for 40 years. Samuel lowered his eyes again. Claire noticed his fingers tighten against the cane handle. The courtroom faded from Samuel's mind once more. Thick jungle fog rolled through dark trees beneath weak moonlight. Rainwater dripped from leaves while exhausted soldiers huddled together in silence, listening to distant helicopters fighting weather somewhere beyond the mountains. Young Lieutenant Victor Langford sat against a broken radio case, trying to hide shaking hands from the others. Samuel remembered removing the compass from his own pack and pressing it into the lieutenant's palm. If we get separated, follow west until daylight. Then came another memory. Younger voices. Nervous laughter around a dim red flashlight. The smell of wet canvas and burned coffee heating over a tiny stove while exhausted men pretended not to be afraid. Then the memory dissolved beneath courthouse lighting once again. General Langford carefully wrapped the compass back inside the cloth. Colonel Bishop used to say one thing about you, he said quietly toward Samuel. He said every man in that jungle stopped panicking the second they heard your voice. Samuel stared silently toward the floor for several seconds before answering. Most of them were just kids. The general nodded slowly. You were? Only 26. The room fell silent again. Claire looked around the courtroom and realized something remarkable had happened without anyone noticing. Nobody saw Samuel Mercer as an old man anymore. The cane, the gray hair, the tired coat, all of it had disappeared beneath the quiet gravity surrounding him now. Judge Pierce suddenly looked very small behind the bench. Judge Alan Pierce slowly lowered himself back into his chair behind the bench, but the authority that had once filled his posture was gone. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. Everyone inside could feel it now. The military police standing silently near the walls. The federal officials near the entrance. The rows of stunned civilians in the gallery. All eyes remained fixed on Samuel Mercer, the quiet old man who still sat calmly beneath the harsh courthouse lights with one hand resting over a scarred medal most people in the room had been moments away from calling fake. General Victor Langford stood beside him in complete silence for several seconds more before finally turning toward the bench again. Judge Pierce, he said quietly, there is one final detail you should understand. The judge swallowed once. What detail is that? Langford looked down briefly at the old medal hanging against Samuel's chest. Sergeant Mercer was never supposed to receive public recognition for the operation in 1969. Claire Donovan listened carefully from behind her desk while the entire courtroom remained motionless. The general continued slowly. Officially, the mission never happened. Officially, those men were never there. Samuel lowered his eyes slightly, the faintest shadow crossing his weathered face. General Langford exhaled through his nose before speaking again. But when extraction finally arrived after 48 hours, there was one thing every surviving soldier reported independently during debriefing. The general paused. Even Judge Pierce leaned forward slightly despite himself. They all said the same thing. Langford's voice softened. That they stopped believing they were going to die the moment Sergeant Mercer walked back into the jungle to bring the others home. Absolute silence followed. Claire noticed tears gathering quietly in the eyes of an older woman seated near the back of the courtroom gallery. The prosecutor removed his glasses completely now, rubbing his face slowly as if struggling to process the weight of everything unfolding around him. Judge Pierce shifted uncomfortably behind the bench. General, he said weakly, I had no way of knowing any of this. Langford's eyes hardened instantly. No, he answered calmly. But you still chose humiliation before understanding. The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Samuel finally lifted his head slightly. Victor. The general immediately looked down toward him. Samuel's voice remained soft and tired. Enough. The courtroom stilled again. General Langford studied the old veteran carefully for a long moment before nodding once. Claire realized something then. Samuel Mercer was not enjoying this. Not the revelations. Not the attention. Not the power shift happening around him. He looked like a man exhausted by memories he had spent decades trying to bury quietly. Langford slowly stepped backward from the defense table. Then, without warning, the four-star general came sharply to attention directly in front of Samuel Mercer. The movement echoed through the silent courtroom like a rifle crack. Every military member inside the room immediately straightened instinctively. Claire's breath caught in her throat. General Langford raised his hand in a formal salute. On behalf of every man who came home because of you, he said quietly. Thank you, Sergeant Mercer. The room froze completely. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Samuel looked up at the general, standing rigid before him beneath the fluorescent courthouse lights. For several seconds, he simply stared in silence. Then slowly, with visible age in his movements, Samuel raised one trembling hand from the handle of his cane and returned the salute. Claire felt tears sting her eyes instantly. Even the bailiff looked away briefly, jaw tightening hard. Judge Pierce remained frozen behind the bench, watching a four-star general salute the very man he had publicly mocked less than an hour earlier. Samuel lowered his hand slowly and looked toward Langford again. Most of them were kids, he repeated softly. The general nodded once. And because of you, he answered quietly, most of them became old men. Outside the courthouse windows, the gray October clouds finally broke apart, and sunlight spilled faintly across the glass for the first time all morning. For several long seconds after Samuel Mercer returned the salute, nobody inside courtroom 4B seemed capable of movement. Sunlight filtered weakly through the courthouse windows now, cutting pale golden lines across the worn wooden benches and polished tile floor. Dust drifted quietly through the light like slow-moving ash. General Victor Langford lowered his hand first, but his posture remained perfectly straight before the old veteran seated at the defense table. Around the courtroom, military personnel still stood rigid and silent. Even the civilians in the gallery seemed instinctively aware they had witnessed something far beyond ordinary courtroom drama. Samuel slowly settled his trembling hand back onto the handle of his cane. The old metal rested against his chest once more, scarred and worn beneath the faded ribbon. He looked exhausted now, not physically, spiritually, like a man who had carried an invisible weight for so long that even being recognized for it felt painful. Judge Alan Pierce remained behind the bench, staring down at the scene unfolding before him. The arrogance that once sharpened his expression had vanished completely. In its place sat something colder. Shame. Claire Donovan quietly removed her hands from the keyboard in front of her. She had stopped typing minutes ago. Nobody in the room seemed concerned about transcripts anymore. Some moments were too human for legal records to fully capture. General Langford finally looked toward the federal official still standing near the doorway with the sealed folder tucked beneath one arm. The man gave a small, respectful nod. The citation against Sergeant Mercer has already been dismissed, he announced calmly. Effective immediately. Judge Pierce lowered his eyes. No one looked surprised. Samuel simply nodded, once as though the outcome barely mattered to him anymore. Langford slowly turned back toward the old veteran. Do you need help standing? He asked quietly. Samuel gave the faintest hint of a smile. I am old, Victor. Not helpless. A few soft, nervous laughs escaped somewhere in the gallery before quickly fading again. The general's expression softened once more. Still stubborn after all these years. Samuel carefully reached for the edge of the defense table and pushed himself upward slowly with the help of his cane. Every movement carried age in it now. The jungle survivor who once walked through monsoon rain carrying exhausted soldiers on his shoulders had become a thin old man beneath courthouse lighting. Yet somehow the room respected him more with every slow step he took. The military police near the walls straightened further as Samuel finally stood upright. General Langford quietly stepped beside him, not to lead him, but to walk with him. Together, they began moving slowly toward the courtroom doors. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted them. Claire watched the entire room subtly shift as Samuel passed by. People lowered their eyes respectfully. The prosecutor placed his hand over his heart for just a moment. Even the bailiff straightened to full posture as the old veteran moved past him. Judge Pierce suddenly spoke from behind the bench, his voice strained and uncertain. Sergeant Mercer. Samuel stopped near the aisle but did not turn immediately. The judge swallowed hard. I owe you an apology. The old veteran remained silent for several seconds before finally glancing back over one shoulder. Sunlight caught faintly across the scarred metal resting against his coat. No, Samuel answered softly. You owe it to the next man before you judge him. The words settled across the courtroom more heavily than any punishment ever could. Judge Pierce lowered his eyes completely. Samuel turned back toward the doorway. Outside the courthouse, autumn wind drifted softly through the city streets while black government vehicles waited quietly along the curb beneath fluttering American flags. General Langford opened the courthouse door for the old veteran without a word. As Samuel stepped outside into the pale October sunlight, Every military member inside the courtroom came sharply to attention one final time. Samuel paused briefly near the doorway as cool wind stirred the faded ribbon around his neck. For just a moment, he looked upward toward the brightening sky above the city skyline, as though remembering voices long gone carried somewhere inside the autumn air. Then the old veteran adjusted his worn coat, tightened his hand around the wooden cane, and walked slowly forward into the sunlight, while the courtroom behind him remained standing in complete silence. Some medals are made of metal. Others are made of memory, and the heaviest ones are carried long after the war is over.